The courtroom was crowded that morning, filled with people waiting for their cases to be heard. Lawyers in dark suits carried thick folders whispering to their clients, while officers stood near the walls watching everything. The sound of papers shuffling and shoes clicking on the floor mixed with the echo of voices. Everyone seemed tense, as though the air itself carried the weight of judgment. Among the crowd sat a woman who appeared out of place. She was dressed simply, wearing plain clothes that did not shine like the polished suits around her. She was quiet, calm, and kept her hands folded in her lap. Most people did not pay attention to her. A few glanced at her, then looked away quickly, assuming she was just another visitor, maybe a relative of someone facing charges. Nobody imagined she was anyone important. The judge entered the courtroom, and the sound of the gavel struck the air, calling for order. The cases began one after another, with lawyers presenting arguments, witnesses stepping forward, and officers moving around to escort people. The simple woman sat still, watching closely. Her eyes studied everything, though no one noticed. At one point, a young man stood nervously in front of the judge. His lawyer argued that he had been mistreated, that the officers had handled him roughly without reason. The judge seemed distracted, hardly listening. The officers standing nearby smirked quietly, as though they felt untouchable. The simple woman shifted slightly in her seat, her face showing a flicker of concern. Suddenly, the young man's mother cried out from the back row. She begged for fairness, saying her son had been wronged. The judge silenced her sharply, and the officers moved to push her back into her seat. The courtroom atmosphere turned cold. The woman in plain clothes could not remain silent anymore. She rose slowly, her presence calm but firm. She did not shout or wave her arms. She simply spoke, her voice steady and clear enough to cut through the noise. "Is this how justice is handled here?" she asked softly. The question, though spoken quietly, carried across the courtroom like thunder. People turned their heads, surprised that this ordinary-looking woman dared to speak at all. The officers at the side bristled, stepping toward her. They were not used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked so simple. One officer demanded, "Sit down, ma'am. You have no right to speak." But she remained standing, her calm eyes locked on the judge, waiting for a response. The tension in the room rose. Whispers began in the back rows, people wondering who this woman was and why she had spoken at such a bold moment. The second officer, feeling the weight of all eyes, stepped closer to her. Instead of treating her with respect, he made the mistake of treating her like a troublemaker. With impatience and arrogance, he placed his hand firmly on her shoulder, trying to push her down. When she did not move, his action became harsher. The room went silent in shock. Everyone expected her to shrink, to apologize, to retreat back into the background. But the woman did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or fight back. She simply looked at the officer with a gaze so steady it made him hesitate for a split second. Gasps echoed around the room. Lawyers turned their heads, their mouths half open. Even the young man standing before the judge forgot his fear for a moment, staring at the woman with wide eyes. But the most astonishing thing was not what had just happened. It was what came after. The woman, still calm, turned her head toward the bench where the judge sat. Her face carried no anger, only an authority so natural it silenced the whispers around her. She began walking slowly down the aisle. Each step was measured, graceful, almost as if she had walked that path many times before. The officers hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in their expressions. Should they stop her? Should they hold her back? Something about her manner made them freeze. It was as if an invisible force held them still. The lawyers whispered to one another. Some frowned, annoyed at the interruption, while others leaned forward, curious. The people in the back rows leaned in too, their eyes following every step she took. The room seemed to shrink around her, all attention drawn to the simple woman who had dared to stand. The judge, caught off guard, struck the gavel. "Order in the court," he shouted, his voice louder than before. But even his command did not drown out the unspoken power the woman carried as she approached. She did not stop when the officers stepped forward again. She raised her hand calmly, and they froze mid-step, as though unsure why they suddenly could not continue. Her silence spoke louder than their commands. When she reached the front, she turned and looked at the audience, her eyes scanning the room slowly, as though she wanted each person present to remember this moment. The crowd, which had moments ago been restless, now sat utterly still. And then she did something no one could have imagined. She turned and walked up the steps toward the judge's bench. A collective gasp filled the air. The very idea seemed impossible. How could this woman, treated just seconds ago as if she were nobody, dare to approach the seat of authority? Yet she did not hesitate. She reached the high chair where the judge sat and with quiet determination, placed her hand on the wooden surface. The judge himself looked confused, even a little shaken. The woman did not ask permission. She did not wait for approval. She lowered herself into the seat slowly, as though reclaiming something that already belonged to her. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The sound of her plain clothes brushing against the chair seemed louder than the gavel had earlier. Everyone stared, their disbelief hanging in the air like smoke. In that moment, she no longer looked like a simple woman. The quiet strength in her eyes, the way she held her posture, the steady calm in her expression, it all carried the unmistakable weight of authority. She did not need to announce who she was. Her presence alone told the room that something extraordinary had just been revealed. The officers exchanged nervous glances, no longer so certain of themselves. The lawyers who had smirked earlier now sat frozen, unsure of how to react. And the young man, still standing before the bench, looked at her as if a light had suddenly broken through a storm. The plain woman who had been ignored minutes ago was no longer invisible. She sat in the judge's seat, higher than anyone else in the room, her calm gaze watching the courtroom that had misjudged her. The people knew, without words, that everything had just changed. The entire courtroom froze in stunned silence. The air was thick with disbelief, as if time itself had paused when the woman lowered herself into the judge's seat. Just moments earlier, she had been treated as though she was nobody, someone to be silenced and pushed aside. Now, sitting on the high bench, her presence changed everything. She looked out over the courtroom, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The officers who had touched her stood stiff, their mouths opening and closing as though they wanted to say something but could not find the words. The judge who had been presiding sat frozen in his chair, still holding the gavel in his hand. His eyes darted around, searching for an explanation, for some way to make sense of what had just happened. The lawyers exchanged worried glances, whispering behind their hands. The woman raised one hand slowly, not in anger, but in quiet authority. Her gesture carried more weight than the gavel itself. The whispers stopped instantly. Even the people in the back rows leaned forward in silence, waiting to see what she would do next. "Enough," she said softly. Her voice was not loud, yet it filled the entire courtroom. The officers, embarrassed and angry, took a step forward as though to remove her. But the moment they did, something unexpected happened. The bailiff, who had been standing near the files and documents, picked up a folder. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the papers, scanning page after page. Then his eyes widened. "Wait," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Stop!" Everyone turned to look at him. The officers paused mid-step. The bailiff's face was pale as he held up one sheet of paper. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "This woman, she's listed here." His voice shook, but he read the words clearly. "She is the newly appointed federal judge for this district." A wave of gasps swept through the courtroom. People clutched their mouths, some even standing up in shock. The judge who had been presiding dropped his gavel with a sharp clatter against the bench. His eyes went wide, his mouth dry. The officers staggered back as if the floor beneath them had shifted. Their arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by fear. The lawyers leaned back in their seats, their confidence replaced by uneasy silence. The woman who had been treated as less than nothing was, in fact, the highest authority in the room. The woman, now sitting firmly in the judge's chair, finally spoke again. Her calm voice carried across the chamber. "You thought you knew who I was. You looked at my clothes and made assumptions. You judged without knowledge. That ends now." Her words echoed through the courtroom. No one dared interrupt. Even the ceiling fans seemed to hum more quietly, as though listening. The officers' faces turned pale. They stammered, trying to explain. "We didn't know. We thought she—" "Silence," she said, raising her hand again. The single word shut them down completely. The people in the audience whispered among themselves, astonished. Some smiled in quiet approval, while others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even clapped softly before quickly stopping, afraid of breaking the atmosphere. The judge who had been in charge finally found his voice. He stood, his robe shaking slightly as he looked at her. This must be some kind of mistake," he stammered. "No one told me." The bailiff, still holding the papers, cut him off. "It is no mistake. The appointment letter was signed last week. She was scheduled to take her seat today." He looked down at the document again, then back up at the courtroom. She came quietly, perhaps to see how this court was being run before she revealed herself. The woman nodded once, her calm eyes scanning the room. "That is correct. I came here without introduction. I wanted to see the truth of how justice was being served in this place." Every person in the courtroom felt their heart pound. The weight of her words was heavy. She had seen everything. The way the mother of the young man had been silenced, the arrogance of the officers, the carelessness of the presiding judge. All of it had been witnessed. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Sweat formed on their foreheads. They had not just embarrassed themselves, they had exposed their character in front of the very person who now held their future in her hands. The lawyers who had mocked the woman earlier looked down at their papers, pretending to be busy, hoping not to be noticed. But it was too late. She had already seen them. The woman leaned back in the chair, her voice calm but sharp. "Justice is not about appearances. Justice does not care if someone wears fine robes or plain clothes. Justice cares only for truth and fairness. And what I saw here today tells me this court has forgotten that." Her words struck the room like lightning. People shifted uneasily in their seats, realizing the weight of the truth she spoke. The mother of the young man who had cried out earlier clasped her hands together tightly, tears in her eyes. For the first time, she felt hope. The presiding judge, his pride shattered, tried to defend himself. I have served here for years. This was never enough," she said, silencing him with a firm gaze. "Your years of service mean nothing if fairness has been lost along the way." The room went quiet again. The officers who had touched her earlier trembled visibly now. Their earlier confidence was gone. They looked small, almost helpless as the weight of their mistake hung heavy over them. The woman turned her eyes on them. Her expression remained calm, but her words cut deep. "You thought you could silence me. You thought my voice did not matter. You acted with force instead of respect. Tell me, if you treat me this way, how do you treat others who cannot defend themselves?" The officers lowered their heads, unable to answer. The shame was written all over their faces. The people in the gallery murmured again, louder this time. They were no longer whispering out of fear. They were whispering in awe. They had seen the truth revealed before their very eyes. The young man standing in front of the bench stared at the woman with wide eyes. A moment ago he had been terrified for his fate. Now he felt like justice itself had taken form before him. He knew, without words, that things would be different from this moment on. The woman leaned forward slightly in the chair, her hands resting on the bench. Her gaze moved slowly across the room, from the officers to the lawyers, from the presiding judge to the people in the back rows. Each person felt as if her eyes met theirs, as if she was speaking directly to them. "This court will no longer run on arrogance and fear," she said firmly. "It will run on truth. And today is the beginning of that change." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer filled with disbelief. It was filled with respect. The authority in her voice was undeniable. No one dared question her now. The officers stepped back quietly, no longer trying to stop her. The presiding judge lowered his head, humiliated. The lawyers remained still, their pride crushed. And the people in the gallery, ordinary citizens who had come expecting another day of injustice, felt something they had not felt in years: hope. The woman who had entered the courtroom like a stranger now sat as the rightful authority. The same officers who had tried to silence her seconds earlier now stood powerless. The same judge who had ignored the cries for fairness now looked defeated, and yet the woman remained calm. She had not raised her voice. She had not threatened anyone. All she had done was reveal who she truly was. That alone was enough to turn the entire courtroom upside down. The moment would be remembered by everyone present. A single act of quiet authority had changed everything. The people knew the truth now. Justice had found its rightful seat. The courtroom had never felt so silent. Every eye was fixed on the woman seated firmly in the judge's chair. What had started as an ordinary day had transformed into a moment that none of them would ever forget. The officers who had tried to silence her moments earlier now stood frozen, their confidence gone. The presiding judge, who had ruled with authority for years, sat powerless, his gavel abandoned on the desk. The lawyers, who once looked down on her, avoided her gaze as if their very pride had been exposed. The woman leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the polished wood of the bench. Her calm eyes scanned the room slowly, making each person feel seen. There was no anger in her expression, but there was no softness either. It was the kind of gaze that carried truth, one that could not be ignored. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady, each word sharp as steel yet calm as water. Before I take one more step as your judge, there is something that must be addressed. Justice is not about robes or titles. It is about fairness, truth, and respect. And what I witnessed here today tells me this courtroom has lost its way. Her words struck deeply. The mother of the young man sitting in the gallery held her breath, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she felt that someone powerful had truly heard her pain. The young man himself stood straighter, his fear slowly turning into hope. The woman's gaze turned to the officers who had laid hands on her. Step forward. They hesitated, looking at each other nervously. Neither wanted to move, but her steady eyes left them no choice. Slowly, with their heads slightly lowered, the two officers walked forward until they stood before the bench. The room was so quiet that the sound of their shoes clicking on the marble floor echoed loudly. When they finally stopped, the woman looked at them for a long moment without speaking. The silence was heavier than any words could have been. "You thought you could silence me," she said softly. "You thought I was beneath you. But I ask you now, if you treat me this way when you thought I was powerless, how do you treat the ordinary people who come through this courtroom every day?" The officers swallowed hard, their faces pale. One of them opened his mouth as if to answer, but no words came out. The other lowered his head completely, unable to meet her eyes. The people in the gallery began murmuring. Their whispers were not of shock this time, but of agreement. They too had seen how officers often treated people unfairly, with little respect. And now the truth was being spoken aloud in front of everyone. The woman raised her hand again and the murmurs stopped. She continued, her words firm but calm. "This court is not a stage for arrogance. It is not a place where power is shown through force. It is a place where truth must shine, no matter how small or simple the person standing here may appear. That is what justice means, and that is what has been missing." Her words carried through the room, wrapping around everyone like a strong wind. The presiding judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had ruled this court for years with little challenge, but now his actions, or rather his neglect, were under the harsh light of truth. She turned her gaze to him. "You allowed disrespect in this courtroom. You silenced voices that asked for fairness. You ignored the cries of people who came here seeking hope. Tell me, is that justice?" The judge stammered, his face red. I have always followed the law. Following the law is not enough if fairness is lost in the process," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly, though it was still controlled. "You hold power not to rule people, but to protect them. Do not forget that." The room stirred again. Even the lawyers, who had once thought themselves untouchable, lowered their eyes. The weight of her words reached everyone. The woman then turned her attention to the young man who still stood nervously before the court. "Step closer," she said gently. He did, though his legs trembled. He had expected to leave this courtroom with despair, maybe even punishment he did not deserve. But now, as he stood before the new judge, he felt something he had never felt in this place before. Hope. She looked at him with kindness, though her expression still held authority. "Tell me what happened to you." The young man glanced at the officers nervously before speaking. They treated me roughly," he said softly. "I did not fight them. I did not resist. But they pulled me, pushed me, and made me feel like I was less than human. When my mother cried out for help, they told her to be quiet. They made me believe that no one would ever listen to me here." The woman nodded slowly, her expression unchanged, though her eyes showed a flicker of sadness. She turned her gaze back to the officers. "Do you hear him? Do you understand the damage you cause when you treat people this way? Justice is not only in the sentence given, but in how people are treated along the way." The officers did not respond. They looked down at the floor, their shame visible to all. The woman straightened in her chair, her voice growing stronger. "This ends today. This courtroom will not be a place of fear. It will be a place of fairness. And anyone who stands in the way of that will answer for it." The crowd in the gallery erupted in quiet applause, their hands coming together hesitantly at first, then louder. The sound filled the room, breaking the heavy silence. For once, the people felt their voices mattered. The woman raised her hand and the applause stopped quickly, but the hope remained in their eyes. She had not needed to shout or demand their respect. She had earned it by speaking truth. She then called for the bailiff. "Bring the appointment papers forward," she ordered. The bailiff walked nervously to the bench, holding the official letter. He handed it to her with both hands, bowing his head slightly as he did. She opened it and read a few lines aloud. "This document, signed by the federal committee, confirms that I am now the appointed judge of this district." She held it high for all to see. "And from this day forward, things will change." The officers stepped back further, knowing they were standing on dangerous ground. The presiding judge lowered his head in humiliation, realizing he had lost the courtroom's respect. The lawyer sat frozen, unsure how to respond. The woman placed the paper down, her calm voice steady once more. "There will be an investigation. Those who have abused their power will answer for it. Those who have ignored injustice will be questioned. And those who believe they could treat people unfairly will learn otherwise." The people in the gallery exchanged hopeful looks. Some smiled, some wiped away tears, but all of them felt a sense of relief. For the first time, they saw that fairness was possible. The young man's mother clasped her hands together tightly, whispering words of thanks under her breath. She looked at the woman in the judge's chair with admiration, knowing she had witnessed history. The courtroom, once a place where voices were silenced, now rang with the sound of truth. And the woman who had been ignored at first was now the center of it all, calm, firm, and unshakable. What had been hidden was now revealed. She was the judge, and she was here to restore what had been lost. The air inside the courtroom was heavy, almost too heavy to breathe. Everyone felt that something powerful had shifted. The woman who now sat in the judge's seat had turned the entire room upside down. A few minutes ago, she was seen as an ordinary visitor. Now she was the highest authority in the room, and every eye was fixed on her. The officers who had mistreated her looked pale, their uniforms suddenly feeling like chains. The presiding judge slouched in his chair, no longer proud or confident. The lawyers sat stiffly, afraid of being noticed, and the people in the gallery leaned forward with hope burning in their eyes. The woman let the silence last for a moment. She wanted everyone to understand the weight of what had just happened. Then, with a calm but firm voice, she began to speak. "This courtroom must stand for fairness. Without fairness, there is no justice. Without justice, there is no respect for the law. And today I saw arrogance where there should have been humility, and force where there should have been respect." Her words cut like a blade. The officers shifted nervously, and the presiding judge lowered his head. The woman paused, allowing her words to settle in every heart before continuing. She turned toward the bailiff. "Call for the records," she ordered. "Bring me the files of the officers who stand here." The bailiff hurried to obey, pulling folders from a cabinet and placing them on the bench. The woman opened one, reading quietly. The sound of turning pages filled the tense air. Then she looked up, her eyes sharp. "These officers have multiple complaints of mistreatment," she announced, but none of those complaints were taken seriously. "Why?" No one answered. The silence was louder than any words. The presiding judge avoided her eyes, and the officers froze where they stood. The woman's voice rose slightly, though it remained calm and controlled. "Do you know what happens when voices are ignored? When people cry for help but their words are buried? Injustice grows, fear grows, and the law becomes nothing but a shadow." The people in the gallery nodded. They had seen it themselves, felt it in their lives. Her words were not empty. They reflected their truth, she continued, her voice steady. "From this day forward, that will not happen again in this courtroom. Every complaint will be heard. Every action will be reviewed. And every officer, lawyer, or even judge who abuses their power will answer for it." The officers swallowed hard. One of them tried to speak, his voice shaky. We were only following procedures." "We didn't," the woman cut him off with a raised hand. "Procedures do not excuse disrespect. Procedures do not excuse cruelty. The law is not a weapon to silence people. It is a shield to protect them." The officer fell silent, his eyes dropping to the floor. The woman leaned forward, her eyes moving from one officer to the other. "Today you will be suspended from duty until a full investigation is carried out. You will not touch another citizen. You will not step into another courtroom, and you will not wear the badge until this matter is resolved." The announcement sent a wave through the room. People gasped softly. Some even clapped before quickly stopping themselves. The officers' faces turned red with humiliation, but they could not protest. They had no power left. The presiding judge finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, perhaps we can discuss this privately." "These matters, there will be no private discussions," she said firmly, cutting him off. "Justice must be seen by the people. Justice in darkness is not justice at all." The gallery erupted in murmurs of agreement. For too long they had seen decisions made behind closed doors where truth was hidden. Now it was all happening in the open. The woman's gaze shifted to the lawyers seated at their tables. Some of them had looked down on her earlier, whispering and mocking when they thought she was just a poor visitor. Now they sat silently, afraid of her eyes falling on them. She did not let them escape. "And as for you," she said, her voice sharp, "I watched how you smirked when people cried out for help. I saw how you dismissed the voices of those who are not as powerful as you. Let me remind you, the law does not exist for your pride. It exists for truth. And if I see arrogance again in this courtroom, I will hold you accountable." The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads. Others nodded quickly, desperate to show obedience. The woman's words left no room for doubt. Then she turned her attention back to the people in the gallery. Her expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "To the citizens sitting here today, your voices matter. Your cries matter. Do not ever think you are too small to be heard. From this day forward, you will be heard in this courtroom." The mother of the young man who had cried earlier pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered softly, "Thank you, thank you." Her son stood taller beside her, his heart swelling with relief. The woman allowed the moment to settle before continuing. "This is not about me. This is about restoring dignity to this place. This is about making sure no one is silenced because of their clothes, their skin, their background, or their lack of power. This is about making justice real again." Her words struck deep. The people in the gallery began to clap softly again. This time the applause grew louder, filling the entire courtroom. It was not just polite clapping. It was the sound of people believing again. The woman raised her hand gently and the applause stopped, though the energy remained strong. She leaned back in the chair, her expression calm but resolute. "From this moment," she declared, "this courtroom will no longer be ruled by fear. It will be ruled by fairness, and anyone who cannot accept that may leave." Her words echoed against the high walls. No one moved. Everyone knew this was a turning point. The presiding judge, still trembling, tried once more to speak. "But, Your Honor, She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You will also be investigated. Years of neglect cannot be hidden under the robe of authority. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." The judge's face fell. He sank into his chair, defeated. For years he had enjoyed power without accountability. But now the light of truth had found him. The woman let out a slow breath, her calmness returning. "This is not vengeance. This is correction. This is the law returning to its true purpose." Her words settled in the air like a promise. The people in the gallery would never forget this day. They had seen the balance of power flip in front of their eyes. They had seen officers silenced, lawyers humbled, and a careless judge held accountable. And they had seen it all done not with anger or violence, but with calm truth. The woman who had been underestimated now stood as a symbol of justice itself. And though she had only just taken her seat, she had already changed the courtroom forever. The gallery erupted once more into applause, this time louder, stronger, unstoppable. The sound echoed through the halls, spilling outside where reporters waited. The news would spread like fire. And through it all, the woman sat firmly in the chair that belonged to her, her calm gaze steady, her voice still carrying strength. The people knew this was only the beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded by the time the session ended. Reporters, photographers, and curious citizens gathered outside, waiting to hear what had just taken place inside. Whispers spread quickly, each one more dramatic than the last. Some said a stranger had taken the judge's chair. Others said officers had been suspended on the spot. Nobody outside knew the full truth yet, but they all felt that something important had happened. Inside, the atmosphere was unlike any the courtroom had ever seen. The energy was alive, thick with both relief and disbelief. The officers who had been suspended were escorted out, their heads low, their pride broken. The presiding judge remained in his chair, silent and defeated, knowing that his years of unchecked authority had come to an end. The lawyers, once confident and dismissive, sat still and humbled, waiting for the next words that would shape their futures. At the center of it all sat the woman who had begun the day as a silent observer and ended it as the most respected figure in the room. Her calm presence filled the space, her eyes steady as she looked over the crowd. She lifted her hand, and once again silence fell. "Justice has no meaning if it is not seen, if it is not felt," she said softly, though her words reached every ear. "Today we begin again. Today this courtroom is reborn." The people listened, their hearts stirred. The young man who had stood before the court earlier wiped his eyes quietly. His mother sat beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispering prayers of gratitude. For them, this moment meant more than words. It meant dignity restored, voices heard, and hope returned. The woman continued, her tone stronger now. "I did not take this seat to be served. I took this seat to serve the truth, to serve the people, and to serve the law as it was meant to be. From this day forward, arrogance will not rule this courtroom. Fear will not silence it. Only truth will guide it." Her declaration sent a powerful wave across the room. For years, many had entered this place expecting unfairness, believing the law was only for the rich, the powerful, or those in uniform. But now they saw something different. They saw fairness taking root again. The applause that followed was louder than ever before. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even crying. The sound filled every corner, echoing off the tall walls and spilling into the hallway. For a moment, the courtroom was not a place of judgment, it was a place of hope. When the applause calmed, the woman stood. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her every movement commanding respect without demanding it. She looked once more at the officers who had been escorted out, then at the presiding judge, then at the lawyers. Her eyes finally settled on the people. "You will leave this courtroom today knowing that your voices matter, and when you return tomorrow or any day after, know this: you will not be silenced. You will not be ignored. You will be treated with the fairness you deserve." The mother in the gallery could not hold back her tears. She whispered again, bless you," as she clutched her son's arm. The woman gave a final nod to the bailiff. "Court is adjourned." With those words, the gavel struck once more, not with the sound of arrogance, but with the sound of truth. The crowd inside rose to their feet as she stepped down from the bench. The weight of the moment followed her as she walked through the courtroom doors. Outside, the waiting reporters rushed forward, microphones raised, cameras flashing. The people who had witnessed the event followed, their voices buzzing with excitement. Reporters shouted questions. "Who are you, really? What happens next? What will you do about the officers?" The woman stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. She looked out at the sea of faces, her expression calm, her voice steady. "My name does not matter today," she said firmly. "What matters is that justice has found its rightful place. What matters is that the law belongs to the people, not to those who misuse it, not to those who silence others, but to every single person standing here." The crowd erupted in cheers. Some lifted their fists in support, others clapped, and many simply stood in awe, knowing they had witnessed a turning point in history. She raised her hand, and the noise softened. "The officers have been suspended. There will be a full investigation. The presiding judge will be questioned, as will every lawyer who has shown arrogance in this court. No one is above the law, not even those who claim to serve it." Her words were firm, but they carried a promise of fairness rather than vengeance. The people believed her. They saw it in her eyes, heard it in her tone. This was not about pride or revenge. This was about rebuilding trust, about restoring dignity, about showing the people that justice still had a place in their lives. News spread quickly. By the end of the day, headlines blazed across newspapers and television screens. New judge stuns courtroom. Officers suspended on the spot. Justice restored in unforgettable session. Videos of the moment she walked to the judge's seat flooded the airwaves. Replayed again and again, people across the city watched in amazement, inspired by her calm courage. In homes, families talked about her. In offices, workers shared the story. In schools, teachers told students about the day justice stood up. Her name was on everyone's lips and her story was told with awe. But for the woman herself, it was not about fame. As she sat later in her quiet chambers, away from the flashing cameras and excited crowds, She thought only of the people she had seen that day, the mother's tears, the young man's trembling voice, the fear in the eyes of those who had been silenced for too long. She whispered softly to herself, "This is only the beginning." The next morning, the courthouse was filled again, but this time the energy was different. People walked in with their heads higher, their steps steadier. They believed change was possible because they had seen it with their own eyes. The officers who once walked proudly now moved cautiously, knowing they were under watch. The lawyers who once smirked now carried themselves with humility. Even the presiding judge, still awaiting investigation, carried himself with less arrogance, and when the woman entered, dressed in her official robe at last, the entire courtroom rose to their feet, not out of fear, but out of respect. She sat in the judge's chair again, her eyes steady, her presence calm. She struck the gavel and spoke the words that would echo for years to come. "Court is in session." The sound of those words, spoken with quiet strength, carried more power than any shouting ever could. It was the sound of a new beginning, the sound of justice alive once more. From that day forward, the courtroom was never the same. People no longer feared entering its doors. They believed in it again. They believed in her. And the woman who had once been ignored and mistreated became the symbol of fairness for an entire community. Her story spread beyond the courthouse, beyond the city, inspiring others everywhere. She had not needed anger to change the world. She had only needed truth, courage, and the strength to sit in the seat that was always meant to be hers. And so, in that quiet but powerful way, justice returned to the people.